Welcome to the Integration.Insights podcast, your place to discuss the future of integration solutions. Hi, welcome Kent in our podcast and welcome Sagar in our podcast.
Thank you.
I, in the meantime, know both of you already, but of course, our listeners you probably don't know you. We'll start with Kent. Probably everyone knows you, but still, I will let you introduce yourself.
Sure. So, thanks for having me. So my name's Kent Weare. I'm a principal PM manager on the Azure Logic Apps team. We're focused on building Logic Apps. I've got a sort of long history in integration, been working on it for most of my career, done a lot of BizTalk, done a lot of working in the energy sector in Calgary, and then also been at Microsoft for about 6 years, where I've worked on both Power Platform and then Logic Apps for the last 3 years. So glad to be here.
Welcome. And maybe Sagar, welcome you as well. You're also a new face for our listeners.
Yes, thank you. So, as you said, my name is Sagar Sharma, and I'm working as solution architect for IHC. And I have worked on energy sector, finance sector, digital payments, insurance, etc., in retail also. And I've been working in integration, in architecture domain, enterprise integration, etc. for almost 17 years now. So I think in today's session, we will just see how the integration has started, how it started, like when it started and how it's going now. Yeah.
Okay. Seems like we are all veterans in the integration business with 17 to 20 years of experience. We're not going to talk about BizTalk today. We're going to talk about Azure Integration Services. You know, we all have our battle wounds about BizTalk, but...
no legacy stuff. All new. Yeah.
All new, yes. Maybe a first question, of course, that we do see today that cloud adoption is becoming a strategic priority for a lot of customers. What are, for you, the key drivers that you're seeing in the integration space?
Well, I think for me, it goes back to actually BizTalk. We won't go too deep there, but I think for me, it's more about like solving the business problem and how do we do that most efficiently. And so I kind of have always been a big proponent of like avoid the tax, avoid the plumbing, and focus on solving the actual business problem. And so when I think about Logic Apps, I think that there's a low barrier of entry in order to go ahead and build solutions without having to worry as much about that plumbing or that infrastructure. So there isn't such a thing as Patch Tuesday that you have to deal with, and you can really focus on a platform as a service offering that allows you to focus on the core goals, which is how do you best support the business. So I think that still holds true. I think we've seen a lot of customers where it's not so much a question anymore about cloud. It's more of the default, but there are more, I would say, exceptions where it's like, I still need to run on-prem because I have some specific needs. But I would say the mindset has shifted a lot over the last few years, and that has become the default versus, the alternative a few years ago. It's like, why should we go to the cloud? I think the question is now, why wouldn't we go to the cloud?
Okay. You still see today a lot of customers having those on-premise integration solutions. Today you have different options. You're going for a hybrid model or you're going full cloud. Are there any considerations that customers should be aware of?
Yeah, it is interesting. So we've been working on Logic Apps Hybrid for, I guess, at least a year or so. And it's actually just GA'd recently at the Integrate conference. We announced the general availability of it. And it's been an interesting journey because we've had a lot of conversations with customers. And like I said before, I kind of like default to the cloud. It's not so much a question. But it has been a good realization of just like how important some industry sectors are when it comes to local processing. Like there are elements of like data governance or data sovereignty, but I would say in most cases it's about the proximity to the actual business systems itself, which is super important. So as we go ahead and talk to like manufacturing companies or retail companies, like those are situations where you can't disrupt operations. Like when those systems go down, you are really talking about significant financial impacts. And I think that's where having this proximity is actually quite important. But on the flip side, you don't want to then revert back to old ways either. Like cloud has introduced a lot more efficiency when it comes to like deployment and tooling and all of those things. So that's where hybrid kind of is best of both worlds in my mind, where it's like gives you that proximity that you need so you can deploy this locally in your data center, but you can still use your modern DevOps. You can go ahead and use your modern tools and basically address both of those use cases. So I think that's where it's been like, you know, hey, everyone go to the cloud, but then you hear about, okay, well, there's a retailer that loses like $1 million an hour if their systems are down. It's like, yeah, that's kind of important. So let's make sure like we can sort of solve those use cases too. And I think that's what's been an interesting journey. It's not just about data sovereignty, but it's also around like proximity and being resilient to connectivity, like outages.
Yeah. Yeah, we saw that same in the past, is that we had customers that wanted to migrate their existing middleware solution towards the cloud, but then their applications remained on-premise. So we saw issues with low latency, also with reliability. Hybrid could be definitely a good solution there because...
Absolutely, yeah. Like there's the whole ground to cloud, cloud to ground, and you don't want to be making those hops. From a transaction processing perspective too. So I do think it's important consideration. Like you've got maybe your ERP, or you've got, if you're energy, you might have something like your SCADA networks or your telemetry. You don't want to push all of that necessarily. So it makes sense. And I think that's where we called it hybrid for a reason, because there's still opportunities where your workloads could be in the cloud, and having your integration platform up there makes a lot of sense. And then there might be use cases where it's advantageous to have it co-hosted locally, but still having that same platform that allows you to build the same, to monitor the same, to manage the same is huge. And that's really kind of why we called it hybrid, because we wanted it to be Logic App standard. It's not a different SKU. Yeah. It's the same SKU. It really becomes a hosting question. Where do I want to host it? And regardless what I choose, I still have the same experience. And that's really been our core goal.
Right. And I said we're not going to talk about this time, but maybe
it's inevitable.
It's always coming back, but of course
it won't die.
Yeah, we are today. A lot of customers are migrating away from BizTalk towards Azure Integration Services. What are like the common strategies that you see? How we have our way of working, of course, but what are typical ways of migrating that you see coming in the market?
It's been super interesting because we've had some customers that have done the whole thing. Like they've shut down the BizTalk servers, they've moved on, and they're in the cloud. So we do have a lot of those, and we have a lot of big customers that have done that. Then I would say we've got some that are kind of in this sort of middle ground, where they've been like, okay, selectively those workloads that can go to the cloud, they're there. Or there could be new integrations, new interfaces that have been built, and they're like, well, there's no point putting those on BizTalk. We might as well like modernize those and go to the cloud. So I think there's those. And then I think there truly is some customers where they just haven't been able to, or there hasn't been a viable option for them. And I think that's where now that we've GA'd Logic Apps Hybrid, there's like fewer of those reasons to not go to Logic Apps. And then obviously run it where it makes most sense for you, but like there is no modernization in BizTalk, right? Yeah. And I think when we talk about everything we've announced here recently with AI and sort of the opportunities with AI, it really, a customer really needs to think long and hard about why would they continue to want that when there's all of these other sort of trends that are emerging in the industry as well. And I get why people historically like have said, hey, I need this to run on-prem, you haven't given me a good option, and that's fair, but I feel like that is shifting, and I'm not so sure that's still the case now that we've gone GA.
Yeah. I still see, especially with the migration, a lot of customers of us ask is there not a migration tool that actually can migrate my existing flows towards Azure? Our opinion is always let's also take the opportunity to actually optimize the existing business processes and actually see where can we benefit from, on one hand, the features of Logic Apps and the cloud itself.
Yeah, no, you're throwing hardballs now. So we did look at this, and there was an earlier attempt at a migration tool. And I think we came to this realization that the architectures truly are different. And that if you do try to auto-migrate, you're probably going to implement some sort of anti-patterns in the cloud, or you're going to have some sub-optimizations from that perspective. And so what we did is we shifted our strategy a little bit, and we said, okay, what are the areas that a customer will spend the most time on? And it's usually those customizations, so things like data transformations, schemas. Maybe you've got some like scripting functoids where you've written .NET code, and then even like custom pipeline components or just like custom components that you use in your orchestration. Those are things that a customer has built because like they've needed to. There's a specific reason. So if those are the things that typically take the most time, then why don't we do our best to help them preserve those investments and allow them to lift and shift those components to the cloud? And that's really what we've done, right? So you can take your maps, your schemas, your custom code, your scripting functoids, in some cases, most pipeline components, and be able to lift and shift, move those to the cloud. And then it's more about focusing on what's changed. And yes, like the BizTalk orchestration engine is quite capable, the Xlang, but it's like more than 20-ish some years old, right? So things change, folks, and like we need to change with it. And so that's where like that's not coming to the cloud. We have our own workflow orchestration engine in Logic Apps. You can go ahead and address many of those same use cases or patterns, but the implementation is different. And that's where we kind of got into a hang-up when you try to go ahead and migrate something that doesn't sort of exist in the same form. And that's where you're right. Like, this is the opportunity for customers to sort of reimagine, re-architect how they go ahead and build these things. But on the flip side, preserving those custom components. And I think one area that people often forget about is this role of API management. Like, that didn't exist in BizTalk, rather.
Yeah.
Like, there's nothing that's close to that other than maybe a proxy server. Like, that's an opportunity. Hey, like, you want to use that now that you're in the cloud. Remember how terrible it was to go ahead and expose interfaces from BizTalk to the public internet? Not a lot of fun. Now that's really easy with API management. So that's a great example of why it makes sense to modernize and re-architect pieces of your solution, because there's better ways of doing things now than there was historically.
Yeah, and I agree with it, especially the modern solutions with REST APIs. In
REST in BizTalk's not fun.
No, I had one situation with a colleague that I can say without saying the customer, of course, but he had to do a BizTalk interface again with REST APIs. I think he called me every day.
Thoughts and prayers.
And you know that with Logic Apps, it goes fast. It goes in a few hours. You can get it nicely to work. It works out of the box. Yeah. And that's normal because those technologies evolved over time. Logic Apps is more suitable for modern integrations.
For sure.
And especially also with the migration, we also see eventing coming back, taking advantage of eventing to actually make integrations is sometimes better than just start polling.
Oh, you mean you don't miss building custom scheduler pollers in BizTalk?
No. No. I'm glad we were gone with that.
Building Windows services and task scheduler to support or complement, the processes and their triggers.
Maybe we will do that again with hybrid. You never know.
Yeah. Let's see.
Hopefully you don't have to.
Yeah. So can you just explain that the Logic Apps which we used to have in cloud, consumption based on a different framework, standard maybe on a different runtime, how does this hybrid deployment works, So
the hybrid deployment, our goal around that, or design principles around that, was that it is Logic Apps standard, right? And so it's not one of those things where we want to think that it's a different SKU. Like, that is not, it's not something you migrate to. It's one of those things where you truly do build it once, and it becomes a matter of where do you then go ahead and deploy it. So it is completely based on Logic Apps standard. There's a few different subtle differences when we think about the runtime. So today, if you're going to run in the cloud, you would actually go ahead and deploy to a workflow service plan or to an ACE v3. And those actually run on Windows, Windows technology. When we think about hybrid, it actually runs on top of like Kubernetes clusters and containers, which are generally Linux, in this case, Linux. So that's been kind of interesting for us as we support like the Linux runtime to actually to support these different workflows in the execution model. But from a functional perspective, it is Logic Apps standard. So what we need to do as we move forward is make sure that we've got feature parity. Because what we don't want you to do is have to look in a table and say, okay, I need this use case to run on-prem, so like what are the features I have access to? And this one's going to run in the cloud, and have to figure that out. That, if we are not doing that, hold us accountable, because that's not the goal. But otherwise, it is Logic App Standard. So you're in VS Code.
Mm-hmm.
You can develop there. You can check into your CI/CD processes, go ahead and deploy it. We actually also support Portal, which is kind of interesting too. So you can be in the Azure portal, on the internet, making changes in the designer, adding connectors, logic, etc., hitting the save button, and then what we'll actually do is we will push those workflow changes down to your Arc-enabled Kubernetes cluster and drop that workflow on the SMB share that you've configured when you've gone ahead and provisioned that. So it is, that's kind of the way it is, and like that's on purpose. We want this to really be portable and say, hey, maybe I need to start on-prem because of, our comfort with the cloud, and then maybe over the time you feel better about the cloud and you can move it to the cloud. We don't want you rebuilding stuff. It really becomes a matter of deployment. You would go in, change your deployment target in your CI/CD scripts, and the intent is that, now you're running in the cloud and you didn't change your application. So that's a core goal and core design principle that we've had when we started this.
Nice. And you said Arc enabled. So what is the role of Azure Arc in this whole deployment setup?
Right. So it really is a connectivity agent from that perspective. So if you think about it, so we've got the runtime, right? We'll be in your data center or your customer-owned infrastructure. We do have our control plane, which still sits in the cloud, right? And basically that's going to give you the API access to perform operations on the runtime itself.
Mm-hmm.
So we need the ability to tunnel those requests back and forth. And the way that we've done this is through the Arc enablement of the service. So Arc is a feature or a service inside of Microsoft, and it's used by other platforms. And so this is one of those things where we didn't custom build something just for Logic apps. We're leaning on other technology inside of Microsoft that's proven and actually used out with other services like SQL Server, and that's basically why it exists.
Okay. And how much comparable it is with the Logic App standard deployment in the cloud? Which means if we compare Logic App hybrids with Logic App in cloud, how would you parameterize things like scalability or latency or any other feature parity which these two different type of deployments may have?
Well, it should be fairly similar. I think the one difference with hybrid is that because it is running on top of containers and Kubernetes, the scaling works a little bit differently than in the cloud. So we are using Kata scaling, and part of this is because we are leveraging the Azure Container Apps platform as an underlying dependency, and they've got just some additional capabilities that don't exist in our app service plans. But other than that, it's pretty similar from that perspective. The difference would be the resource type that you go ahead and create under the hood when you use your deployment scripts, right? Like today, if you're doing your infrastructure from a deployment perspective, you're going to go ahead and create a resource that is going to be of type the basically workflow service plan. The difference here is we're actually going to go ahead and create a ACA connected environment, and under the hood we create an ACA connected app, and basically we would deploy the Logic app there. Otherwise, fairly similar. That would be one of the subtle differences, is the scaling.
And is it like very resource intensive, or you can deploy it also on a lightweight hardware, or how it is?
I think this one, mileage does matter, right? Like it's the magical question, right? Like it comes down to like, what is the transaction throughput that you're expecting? What are the size of messages that you're expecting? And so you do need to do some element of like tuning from that perspective. Now, we have published some blog posts that I would consider some baselines, because we do get this question. It's like, hey, how is this going to perform? And so we've taken some base use cases and said, okay, this is the type of throughput that you can expect with this specific configuration. And that includes like the number of CPUs on the cluster plus the sort of SQL Server capabilities as well, just to give you a kind of a baseline. But the reality is it does depend, because every integration has some different characteristics. What I will say is that it does perform very well relative to the cloud, and so customers can expect at least the same level of performance. In some cases might be a little bit better, but people should feel confident that this platform can scale.
Okay. And I think another interesting question which customers would ask will be around pricing. So how the pricing will be different,
Yeah, the pricing is, well, it's similar, but it's different. It's similar in the sense that there is a per hour charge that we do offer. So if you go into Workflow Service Plan, there is a per hour charge that's going to be based upon like an instance of a WS1, a WS2, or a WS3 plan. Now, with each of those instances, like WS1, 2, or 3, there's also a configuration when it thinks about memory, right? So you get so much RAM per of those configuration too. Now, what we do on the hybrid side is we do charge basically per VPCU per hour. Mm-hmm. So you still kind of have this dynamic pricing in the sense of like if you scale out because you need to burst, we will charge you just for those vCPUs for that specific period of time. Now, when you scale back in, you'll only pay for what you're using. So I think it does give customers similar experience to what they see in the cloud. Now, what we've learned with Kate is we can actually scale out and back in faster with hybrid. So customers might see a little bit of a benefit from that perspective. The other thing that is a little different is that we don't meter based upon your memory. So on hybrid, there's no sort of constraints about memory. If you want to throw more memory in your box because maybe you've got larger messages, we don't charge you more for that. When we go ahead and think about the cloud and we talk about WS1, well, what that actually is a VM. So a VM has naturally compute, but it has memory too. So when you go to WS2, it has more memory than WS1, and WS3 has more memory than a WS2, right? Yeah. So that is a little bit different from that perspective, but once again, it's probably a good thing for customers. You get a little bit more control, especially when you think about memory from that perspective. Now, one other difference people need to account for is that in the cloud, you naturally have Azure storage. That storage is there for your persistence, but it's also there for your run history and basically the archiving of all of those message bodies, inputs, and outputs. On premises in Logic Apps Hybrid, you would be using SQL Server. So a customer needs to bring forward their own SQL Server license. If it's one of those things where you were running BizTalk, you have those licenses, you can reuse those. We don't make you buy new ones. We don't care as long as the box is licensed, kind of, that's great. Use whatever you have from that perspective. Or if you want to use like the SQL, basically the Arc-enabled SQL Server, where it's more of on-prem, but it's more metered per hour, you can also use that too. Don't have to, but you're welcome to if you prefer that model. So you don't have to go, say, update your EA and sort of put these like SQL Server cores on your EA. If you want to do more of a pay-as-you-go plan through Azure, you're welcome to do that too, even though it's running on-prem.
Okay, great. Thanks.
And you mentioned the data is stored in SQL Server. There is, of course, dependency with Azure for the control plane. But of course, the data itself, that is not going to the runtime history, that is not going to be shared with Microsoft. It remains on-premise.
So that's true. There's a little bit of a nuance there in the sense that run history does not get pushed to the cloud. Like, we're not interested in it. It's your data. But if you go to the Azure portal and you're logged into the Azure portal and you want to say, hey, I want to look at the run history for a transaction, naturally, there's a query that happens, right? Where from the browser and an API, that data is retrieved so that the screen can be drawn or produced that includes all of the inputs, outputs. But it's not persisted in the cloud. It's not shipped to the cloud. It's more of on demand as requested through the portal.
Okay.
Features that actually, new features. A feature that was introduced last year at Integrate was actually the business process tracker. I still call it BAM. I still have my background, of course, and probably one of the very few people in the world, I think, that very liked the feature in BizTalk and used it a lot. But I do know that you invested with Microsoft a lot in the business process tracker. How do you see that feature actually evolving over the coming years?
Yeah, so what's funny is we did start by calling it BAM. Actually, that's kind of funny. But what we decided on was that we didn't want to confuse people because if we called it BAM, people might think back to the migration stuff we talked about earlier, that there might be an expectation of you can migrate your BizTalk BAM artifacts and have them working in Logic Apps. And this is a perfect example of why a in-place upgrade just isn't reasonable or feasible. Like there was components in BAM, like Excel and that plugin, and we were using SQL Server, and there was like SQL Server analysis services and all this stuff that didn't make as much sense in sort of the new sort of modern cloud. So that's where we decided to change the name to be Business Process Tracking, just so it was clear that this is something different, but it's like the goals are the same, right? And the whole sort of point of BAM was like, how do we take information that is typically trapped inside your middleware platform and expose it to business stakeholders? Like obviously when we think about like IT pros and operations folks, they have access to the data, they have access to the tools, they can see all of the telemetry. But the business is more focused on the business process and the outcome and the status of it as well. So how do we go ahead and expose it to them? So we kind of took the same sort of principles or goals and said, okay, how do we make this more cloud native from that perspective? So we just announced the general availability at Integrate. And so now customers can go ahead and use this in production and ensure they've got the appropriate support from Microsoft from that perspective. What we've introduced as well as part of this GA is the support for CI/CD deployments, which is pretty important. That was one of the blockers for a lot of customers, previously, because, hey, it's great. I can go into Azure. I can use the Azure portal. I can go ahead and wire up my business process to a Logic app and see it run, and that's great. But now what do I do? How do I get this to test? How do I get this to production? So we've introduced new functionality that allows you to plug this in to your existing CI/CD processes, so you can go ahead and deploy this to test, deploy this in production, and be able to update those mappings. Because what there is when you construct the business process, we ask you to provide a subscription, a Logic app, and a workflow. But as you deploy those across your landscape, the underlying IDs change. So how do you kind of parameterize those so that you can go ahead and reuse those, so you're not like, oh, okay, I need to recreate this in test and recreate that in prod. That's not a great use of time from that perspective. So that's what's recently happened from that perspective. Now, in terms of like, where do we see this going? I think there's kind of a few different areas more immediately. I think the first one is AI. So if you think about AI today, it's really important that you've got this transparency. And if you're going to start taking some of your business processes and infuse them with AI or enrich them with AI, naturally there's going to be business stakeholders that want to know, hey, what's going on? Is this thing running properly? How do I know if it's making the right decisions? And so for the same ideas, like, yes, we got a lot of telemetry that's captured in Logic Apps when we think about AI, but how do we expose that to our business users? So if you think about like Agent Loop is sort of a new concept in Logic Apps, and we'll need to make sure BAM, Business Process Tracking, supports that non-deterministic execution side of things. That'll be something we'll be working on. But then also we're introducing codeful workflows. So that's another thing that was discussed here at Integrate, but then also at Build. And that is the ability for people to go ahead and construct workflows using code. Now, one of the sort of use cases that we get a fair bit from customers is like, hey, I like this business process tracking, but there's parts of my solution where I've authored an Azure function. Can you go ahead and sort of support business process tracking in Azure functions? So it sounds quite trivial to do that, but it's actually not. And the reason for that is that inside of Logic App Standard, we have a tracking engine. And it's the tracking engine that basically takes the tracking profile and knows what data to emit to the data store and when to emit it. So you can't just take that tracking engine and throw it in Azure Functions and it work the same way. But when we think about codeful workflows, it will be using that same tracking engine inside of Logic Apps because it still is Logic Apps. So I think that'll be a big opportunity for customers, because for people that say, hey, I have code that retrieves a message off a queue, and I want to start my business process at that point. Today, that's been a bit of an edge case for us. But if we think about codeful workflows with Logic Apps, that'll no longer be an edge case. So those would be two immediate things that I would see us focusing on. And then I think we also want to hear from customers as they're using this in production, what's missing, how do we better support them, and how do we sort of enrich the business process tracking ecosystem.
Yeah, and you mentioned already that it actually runs separate from your workflow. It's actually tracking profile on top of your workflow. So actually there are no performance considerations here, or that's a concern that we see a lot with customers from if we add additional tracking or additional, that there is a performance penalty. Actually, since you mentioned here, it is separate.
Right, yeah, no, so what we've done is, and this is why some of these features haven't landed in other services, is that when you're using a stateful workflow, we have a series of jobs that run in the background. One of those jobs is the action completion job. So let's say as part of my business process, whenever I send this message, that is a milestone in my business process. Well, I want to be able to track information at that point in time. So what we do is when the action completion job runs, there'll be another sub-process that gets kicked off that is saying, hey, do I have any instructions here from a tracking profile to send a message? And so it's not getting in the way of your execution. In the meantime, the core engine has moved on to the next action to be processed, but we've kind of spawned another sub-process to go focus just on tracking. So you're right. That was another design principle for us. We did not want tracking to get in the way of your executions, and those things need to be treated as separate so that one doesn't interfere with the other. And same thing, for some reason, if the tracking endpoint is down, we can't communicate with ADX, well, we're not going to just lose that message. That is running in a separate process, nor are we going to block the transactional processing. Those things happen separately. So that was another important design decision for us.
Okay, nice.
Yeah.
And maybe also a similar question there is from, we have the business process tracker, we're going to track all that data. Would this data also be possible that we can actually deliver it to custom applications of our customers that they can build their own tracking dashboards?
Yeah, so great question. So you can do this today, and this was another important design decision for us. The last thing we wanted to do was lock this data up and then try to further monetize it for customers. That was not a goal of ours. We were this is your data. How do we actually make this available to you so that you can go ahead and use it the best way that you see fit? And so we do provide a default view transactions experience inside of Azure Portal where you can sort of visualize an overlay of your conceptual business process on top of your tracking data. But we also appreciate that you might not want your business users in the Azure portal, and that there's an extensibility story here that needs to happen as well. And so there's two sort of immediate options. There's probably many others, but Power BI is one of those where you can go ahead and use the Kusto query or Kusto connector to go ahead and connect to your data and build a custom visualization. And that's a scenario where you truly are bringing your data to where your end users are, where your business users are. Another option customers do have is there's Azure Monitor workbooks where you can also create custom dashboards and connect to Kusto as well. So those are two things. There's obviously Kusto APIs that you can use as well, but that's the whole thing. We don't envision us building every single kind of dashboard on the planet, but we also want you to be able to leverage your data. And I think the big thing for us is how do we make sure we can reliably deliver that data in a very timely fashion and then let you sort of leverage it to however you want to go ahead and do it.
Okay, nice.
Yeah.
And then maybe one last question about the business process tracker. We now have that possibility within Logic Apps. Is that an additional service that we need to acquire on Logic Apps, and how does the pricing there work?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. So this is another kind of paradigm shift a little bit too. So because we're using the runtime that you're already paying for, we felt it didn't make sense to double ding you. We didn't want to further monetize that because you're already paying for it. So you should get value from it. So we looked at this as more of an enabler and providing more value in Logic App Standard than an opportunity to sort of gouge customers to extract, a few more dollars out of them. So there is no actual charge for it inside of Logic Apps itself because you're already paying for it from a runtime perspective. Now, a customer does need to provision Azure Data Explorer, And there's obviously costs associated for that, but there's no additional costs from a Logic App perspective. And that also gives you that extensibility option that I was just talking about. It's your data store, so go use it how you see fit. So that was kind of how we sort of blended the models, but we felt like it was a fair proposition for customers where, you might already be using Azure Data Explorer, and so hopefully you don't have to pay for anything new. You might have to if you don't, but then at least you've got control over sort of that cost, and then we didn't see the need to further monetize that for customers.
Yeah, that sounds great, and I think we will definitely use it. We have a lot of use cases at customers where we solved it different ways by using workbooks or by just storing the data into a SQL server and have them run a custom SQL report on top of it just to make the data available to them. I think this actually could be a game changer as well, where we can add additional features to our customers. So.
And one other thing, just along those lines, is so we've got this ability to create custom templates in Logic Apps. And so one of the templates I actually pushed out there was for business process tracking, and it was for alerting. So this gets kind of interesting too, where, you don't necessarily want to always be looking at a dashboard. You might want to basically be notified when there's something that's important, kind of like BAM alerts, right? If we talk about BizTalk. So that's another capability we have. So you can provision this template, and for a particular business process, it'll go ahead and send you an email whenever a basically stage has failed. Now, you can actually go tailor this to whatever you want, but that's another interesting thing. You can do it. And what's also interesting, because it is a Logic app, no one says that has to be an email. That could also be a Teams message. That could be a text message. That could kick off some other process. That could log a ticket in ServiceNow, right? It really becomes this orchestration piece that you can now sort of customize to meet your needs too. So that's another important thing as well, that extensibility is really important, and having the backend in Kusto and in ADX really enables a lot of interesting scenarios too. Yeah.
Okay.
And a very small question on the same thing for our customers: on what services BPM is currently supported?
So it is Logic App Standard, and like I said, for those reasons before, you need the tracking engine. But I'd say there's a couple things to think about. So one was the Codeful one. So I think when people say, I'm using Azure Functions, if that becomes a Codeful workflow, that will be supported.
Yes.
So I think that sort of removes a lot of those needs. The other thing you can do is that, and this is, I would consider this a little bit more of a workaround, but you could always take a Logic app that has a workflow entirely intended for tracking purposes.
Right.
You could expose that as an HTTP endpoint, so it becomes like an API. You could then call that from another application if you wanted to, right? So that is a bit of a workaround. That's fair. But like I said, there's some platform constraints that sort of prevent us from just making this available everywhere, because you kind of have to have the tracking engine on that service as well for this to truly work. But like I said, with the Codeful functions, Codeful workflows I feel like that'll unlock a lot of gaps or sort of that might exist today.
Yep.
Okay. Thank you, Kent and Sagar, for the interesting discussion until now. For our listeners, stay tuned for an interesting part 2, where we will discuss further with Kent and Sagar on the future of integration.